Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll give people a few more seconds to arrive and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome. Welcome to the first Next Generation Now conversation for 2025. We're thrilled you could all join us today to dive into some of the themes from our book, Next Generation Evidence. My name is Tamar Bauer. I'm a co-editor of the book with Kelly Fitzsimmons and Senior Advisor of Strategy and Policy at Project Evident, whose mission is to harness the power of data and evidence for better, more equitable outcomes. Project Evident was formed in 2017, and today we've partnered with nearly 250 nonprofits, funders, policymakers, researchers, and school districts to build their capacity to use data and evidence. Increasingly, we're working with practitioners and funders interested in how emerging technologies like AI can help make data and evidence more actionable, support decision-making, and advance mission attainment. If you're interested in following along with our work, Annette is sharing a link in the chat to sign up for our monthly newsletter. Thanks, Annette. As some of you know, this passion project traces its roots back to 2019 when we held a convening at the Brookings Institution, co-sponsored by the W.T. Grant and Arnold Foundations. Around 100 stakeholders, including strong representation from practitioners, gathered to discuss shared challenges and opportunities, spotlight successful strategies, and generate new ideas about how to make evidence building and use more practitioner-centric, continuous, and equitable. As a result of the convening, we generated 5 principles of next generation evidence and wrote a book with contributions from over 80 wonderful authors that was published by Brookings in 2024. I'll pause for a moment to go through the five principles. They form the framework for the book, and they are that a next generation evidence ecosystem must center practitioners, those doing the work, and the communities they serve, and empower them to drive their own evidence agendas. It must connect equity with data and evidence, both in the way that evidence and data are built and used, and in the types of outcomes we seek to address. It must elevate community voice and empower members to shape and participate in the evidence building process so that results are meaningful and are of value. Fourth, it must embrace an R&D-like approach to enable timely and relevant continuous evidence building. And finally, a next-gen evidence ecosystem must broaden the definition and use of evidence to be responsive to the operational context of practitioners and doers, to attend to systemic and structural conditions, and to prioritize decision-making and learning for all. Today, we are pleased to have 2 of our inspiring, and I would say inspired, authors with us whose work exemplifies these principles. I'm so honored to be joined by John Brothers, president of the T. Rowe Price Foundation and T. Rowe Price Charitable, and Carina Wong, founder and partner, Craft Futures, former senior advisor of innovation and deputy director of education, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Our goal today is to offer all of you attendees practical insights into how philanthropy can reshape their approaches to evaluation in ways that better foster learning, equity, and community empowerment. We'd also love to hear from you, and we'll have some time for Q&A after my conversation with John and Carina. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. We'll be monitoring it throughout, so drop them in whenever. And now, let's dive in. Carina, John, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to invite each of you to share what brought you to the work that you've written about in your essays. And Carina, let's start with you.
Great. Thanks, Tamar. Thanks for having me. Sometimes I introduce myself as a strategist by nature, a designer by heart, and an educator by training. I started my career intentionally in education policy and sort of accidentally found my way into philanthropy. The Gates Foundation, those of you who know it's sort of Gates equals evidence. You can't work at a more evidence-based place. And that's how evidence sort of crept into my life and in that way. But after over a decade of working there, when I wasn't seeing big changes in the education landscape, I really started to question how our strategies are put together and what really constitute evidence, where and how we get it. And that's kind of what led me down this path. I started a little skunk work team at Gates over 3 years to really challenge the traditional way philanthropy was doing things. And since then have just been involved in the space from what I'd say an innovation design and a leadership angle. And most recently finished a fellowship in inclusive R&D with AirDiff, which I can talk about later.
Excellent. Thank you. John, what
Hey,
brought you?
well, thanks so much for having me. So the first thing I would say is I think I've had 3 phases of my career. So I started my career as a community organizer and a case manager and working on the front lines with nonprofits in the basements of churches and community centers and things like that. So I did that for a number of years, and that was inspired by growing up and living within poverty for my adolescence. And so that was, working on the ground was inspired by that work. Slowly but surely, I got into being what they call in my second phase of my career, a pracademic, which is a fun word to say that I was practicing the work, writing on the work, speaking on the work, and I had a consulting firm, and I was a professor at Rutgers and NYU, and just doing a lot of that and traveling the world and talking with folks about better practice for nonprofits, philanthropy, and government. And then got me to the third phase of my career where I'm at right now, where I am in philanthropy and have been leading not only a place-based philanthropy based in Baltimore and doing place-based work led by the self-determination of local communities that we get to live and work in, but also leading a large donor advised fund, doing that on behalf of donors throughout the US. And so those 3 things I hopefully all correspond and connect really well currently, and really excited about being here today.
Terrific. Thank you both. That actually, we have a connection, John. I didn't know I went to Rutgers Law School. There's another, we always find our connections when we talk to each other, but there's another one. Both of your essays call for shifting how philanthropy operates around evidence and evaluation. I'd like to begin by talking about a central idea or story from each of your essays. John, we'll start with you. You write that if philanthropy is to be an active agent for change in our communities, then philanthropists must regain trust with the communities we aim to serve. Can you tell us more? What do you mean by that?
Sure, of course. So the first thing I would say is I don't think it's any secret that the often relationship between philanthropy and the communities and the organizations and leaders that they're aiming to support, that there is a chasm and a challenge between those 2 entities. There's a power dynamic, but that also there is often a gap between those 2. Ladder down from that, and one of the reasons for that is often because of evaluation and metrics and these areas. And so from my end, I think it's best to kind of think about how do you develop relationship with community. You first got to, I always like to start about the relationships that I value personally in my life. And I would assume that all of the amazing people that are on the phone or on the webinar here today have relationships with people that they really value and they trust and that are important to them, wives, husbands, kids, whatever the case may be. And when you think about those relationships, I actually think when you think about the folks that are working on the ground level in community, those relationships that you have personally actually can be very similar to the relationships that you have with folks on the ground. Those individuals that are working in community are unbelievably passionate about the work that they do. They're passionate. They're not selling cell phones, not that that's not important work. They're connected to this work because it's meaningful to them. The number one reason people work in these positions is because they want to affect change in their community. It's not for the salary. It's not for anything else, but that they love this work. That is sacred ground. That is important to understand that for me as a philanthropist, when I walk into that sacred ground, that I understand that it's important that my bedside manner and the how of my work with them be really thought out and important. And unfortunately, oftentimes philanthropies, when they walk into community, they often walk in with this stick of evaluation and metrics and say, I want you to count things, right? So Tamar, if I walked in your home and I said, Tamar, I really care about you. Step on that scale and I want to see how much you weigh.
Right.
And then I'm going to say to you, you should weigh that amount. Not only are you going to be mad that I'm in your home, I'm in your bathroom, I'm asking you to weigh a certain thing, but now the relationship that we have in the area and the neighborhood that you care so much about is flawed. And unfortunately, philanthropy has done that.
Hmm.
Walked in communities with this stick of saying, we care about metrics and evaluation and all of that type of stuff. And ultimately, those relationships are frayed. And so if we can respect the idea that those that are working in community intimately understand and know their world better than we do, they care about making a meaningful difference in their community, and that you as a guest in their community want to be helpful, then you can design evaluation and metrics and all of those things in partnership and led by them. That's key. Nobody right now is sitting in any community saying, I can't wait for Carina or John to tell me how to count things. No one is saying that. And so if we can understand that communities know best what they need, and that we here at T. Rowe, I have infrastructure, Carina at Gates has infrastructure, and we can use that infrastructure to be helpful. But what we shouldn't do is use that infrastructure to push and prod people in ways that are really challenging. And unfortunately, that has been done for many, many decades. And the fraying of relationship between philanthropy and community, it is in many respects because of that dynamic.
That's powerful. Thank you, John. Do you have an example of success that you would like to share at this point? You might want to do it later, but do you have an example of how you've had an experience turning that around? Or
I would hope so. It would be weird if I was like, I really don't know. But I do. I have a couple of them. And I think if, again, if it's built on the framework or the understanding that communities know more about what they need than you do, right? And that if it's built on that, then you can walk in, if invited, to communities and work with them in a really powerful way. And so for us, like, I came to Baltimore in 2015, and my first week here at T. Rowe Price was the week of the unrest after the murder of Freddie Gray here in Baltimore at the hands of police. And I walked into a city on fire, and no one knew me in any communities. And so I was able to go and sit in community centers and in churches and all of these places and listen to community members talk about what was going on in their community. And there certainly were a lot of folks coming from the outside saying, well, violence is important and this is important. And yes, certainly those things were important. But if you really listen to what community was saying, the number one issue in their community at this time by residents who lived and walked the streets in those neighborhoods was access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And that if you lived in central West Baltimore at the time, you had to take 2 buses to get a cucumber. And that's a real challenge. Again, there are lots of challenges in all of our communities, right? But for them, that was the number one issue. And they weren't looking for anyone to walk in and tell them what their issues are, but they were looking for, these are our issues, can you help them solve that? And so as we listened, developing strategy that was led by them, mobilized by them, and us using our infrastructure to support that, they developed a strategy that now in that neck of the woods, because of their power, not mine or the work of T. Rowe Price, but theirs, they were able to now have fresh fruits and vegetables every day of the week for residents there. They own that. It's self-sustainable. It was important to them that they never need philanthropy again, and that's the truth. And so that's a powerful way, I think, and what I've been told, in community self-determination and the assets and resources, and they measure it themselves. They have the highest, what they call, healthy food availability index score in the city of Baltimore right now. Before that, they had the worst. And that was an important metric for them that they owned. They owned the data behind it. They owned the ways to solve it. And as we stand here today, residents in that community get all the vegetables and fruits and all the things they need because it's theirs.
Thank you. Carina, we're going to move to you for a minute. Your essay calls attention to what you call failing on equity in the world of evidence and evaluation. Can you share with the group what failing on equity looks like?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you, John, for that example. I want to build on it a little bit in some of my remarks. When I wrote that chapter, it was much closer to George Floyd, and the door was very open to new ways of thinking. We're in a really different time now. I was reflecting on that this morning, on a lot of the things that are happening right now. And maybe rather than talk about feeling, maybe I can talk a little tactically about sort of what's the lowest bar, the medium bar, and the high bar, and just like get straight in it. So the lowest bar is what I think John said, is building relationships, paying people for their time, seeing another perspective, building, I'm a big fan of Robert Putnam's bridging and bonding capital. Bridging capital being, bonding capital being people that are like me, bridging capital being people that are not like me, and listening to them. And I think that's where John was coming from. I think philanthropy is, as John described, can be really, an evaluation can be really extractive. In the Peace Corps, we used to have this phrase, anyone who's been in the Peace Corps knows this phrase, do no harm, right? That's the lowest bar to me. A medium bar is, so that you're not failing on equity, is really setting targets and being intentional about your actions. In philanthropy, that looks like the number of grants that you give that meet certain sets of equity design principles, or who you give the money to, creating a rubric for various categories of kinds of giving you want to give, and actually trying to measure something and set your own targets for what your own expectations are. We did that at Gates on a small kind of team that I was sitting on, and we thought, well, if we can just get 25% of the grants that meet our equity bar, and just the fact of setting the bar and setting the targets, in that first year, we met 75%. We were at 75% of grants meeting our equity target, but that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been transparent about what we were trying to do. And then I think the highest bar is just changing what you do and how you do it. There are lots of, I was just involved in one, there are lots of challenges out there, and there's equity reviews, and usually it's a pretty superficial sort of, are you working with the target population versus how are you working with the target population, or who is leading this effort? Sometimes I think that the number one thing that if you're going to set targets is really about, are you working with someone with lived experience? That's not often the criteria. It's more, oh, what percentage of kids that are you working with are Black and brown? So I think it's really just changing how you think about what it is, and how you do your work is probably the highest bar in terms of really not failing on equity, is what I'd say.
You've offered a few examples in there. Is there a sort of one other example you'd want to share of success at, succeeding at equity, doing?
Yeah, this is an example. One of the, at the end of my tenure at Gates, I was asked to create the foundation's post-COVID assessment strategy. How do we think about testing, essentially, given COVID took away testing at the state level for a couple years? And one of the things that we did was sort of, we had a set of research questions, and they were around the assessment accountability system. And we could have just asked, what was the impact of this? But we asked, what were the unintended consequences? And that forced us into a new space and a new way of looking at equity and a pretty blunt policy. And so I feel like that's a kind of example where we needed to shift what we were thinking, what we were looking for, and how we were talking about it to get a new perspective on the table.
Thank you. Okay, super interesting. I'm going to ask you both to think about how the themes in your essays, the ones you're both talking about already, align with or perhaps challenge the current landscape. So put another way, are the themes that you're raising, that you're writing about, and the recommendations that you're making for change, do you think that you are, this might sound a little rude and forgive me if it does, but do you think that you are outliers or lone voices in the field? Do you think your perspective is gaining traction? Or even better, do you see the ideas that you're talking about being adopted and incorporated into practice, perhaps by philanthropies? Either, Carina, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think that more and more people are taking up both the practices and principles that you described tomorrow at the top, of the call and the kinds of things that I talked about in my own essay. But I think that's being challenged right now.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
really, I think this is now the time where I think we all have to have a backbone, and we're going to see who has a backbone and not. So I feel like it's a delicate situation where I actually think more and more people are taking up these practices, but I think we're being challenged in this moment as to whether or not we'll continue down that trend or not. I want to give one example. You said something about trends. I want to end on I want to say something positive because I do think there is some positive things going on. So there were two organizations that in the last year or so launched some RFPs for inclusive R&D. One was Renaissance Philanthropy, and the other was AIRDIF, the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund. And both of them did very unconventional things that I want to applaud. AIRDIF put out a call for their next fellowship or their next set of multi-million-dollar grants. And they lowered the bar so that anyone could apply. Literally all you had to do was submit an idea and your resume. And over
Wow.
900 people applied. I may not, Chris at AIRDIF could give you the exact facts, but it was over 900 people applied. And it wasn't about whether you're an academic or that you have certain pedigree. It was a wide variety of people. And in fact, I myself applied and I thought, this really isn't for me. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. But it was so open and I had such a big idea that I said, no, I can do this. So that was one example. And then they narrowed the funnel from there. But the fact that they got over 900 applicants to an R&D project with a lot of practitioners, I think says something.
How many were selected, Carina? Forgive me for interrupting.
Well, 8 were selected and to become fellows, and 1 will be selected in the next month to be the winner of a $25 million grant.
Oh my.
But it started with a pool of 900. And
That's
20
fantastic.
at least gotten interviewed and set. So it narrowed from there. And the pool of fellows was quite diverse as well. Everyone from technologists to brain scientists to people like me. And then the other example I want to give is Renaissance Philanthropy. So Kumar Garg at Renaissance, he opened up a call and said, if you have a big idea about something, submit this big idea and a very small blurb about how you would go about doing the research. And what he was trying to do, or what they were trying to do at Renaissance, was get as many ideas as they could so that they could then categorize those ideas into different topic areas and then work with funders and say, there's a pool of ideas in this topic area. But the bar was quite low and quite expansive. I don't actually know how many, but then they narrowed it down, but they made it very, very open and accessible. To actually get the money or put your idea on the table. So there was no money involved actually in the Renaissance one. It was really just to get a lot of ideals and crowdsource them from the field versus say philanthropy knows best, philanthropy is going to lead, and these are the 3 things we're going to do. So 2 very different processes that give me hope that there are trends in different ways that things are creating more open access to these processes.
Love those examples, Carina. Thank you so much. John, I hope you're not going to depress us now. Go ahead, John. You tell us,
why don't I do
what's
this?
your take on this?
I will start with something that's really awesome. And is Carina, I love your glasses. Those are the dopest glasses ever. So we'll start with that. Now I'll get a little bit sad clown, and then I'll try to end on a positive note. But the thing that I would say that is a big challenge, and I think the characteristics of evaluate, or the kind of the engine pieces of evaluation and metrics, are part of a larger challenge in the philanthropic and nonprofit sector that I've called the helping industry. We have a huge ecosystem of folks that are technology providers, that are evaluators, universities, intermediaries, all of them coming together. These are if you add up the amount of money that is in the technology, for example, the good folks at N10 have said it's about a $4.5 billion industry dedicated to nonprofit technology, evaluation of smaller universities, but all of them are fed by these norms of scale, strategic philanthropy, evaluation, metrics. Listen, I think those words on their own are fine, but I also think strategic philanthropy and scale and those areas have done insurmountable damage at the grassroots level to organizations. And if you look at this helping industry, these people who make money off of developing product and efforts that are actually predatory and do damage on the backs of local nonprofit leaders, often Black and brown leaders in communities doing this work, and are developing and continually trying to develop product that are actually really harmful at the local level. And what we have now as a result of that is we have a countryside of nonprofits who are really good at counting things, but they are not good at learning for their own sake. So I like to think about nonprofits in the terms of wellness. When they step on that scale, Tamar, that we talked about earlier, they step on that scale and they don't know what they're looking at. And they're looking at that number and saying, I wonder what these 5, 10, 15 funders want this number to be, as compared to owning their own wellness and the direction that they should be going in. That is really upsetting and really challenging, that we have a countryside of nonprofits that don't learn for their own sake. And from my perspective, nonprofits are one of the best embodiments of democracy that we have in this country. And we have a governance structure built on the idea that people come together and they gather to figure out how do they help and make their communities a better place, and that their self-determination is ultimately altered because of this dynamic that they don't know how to learn on their own right. That's really challenging. And so what I am hoping for is that not only philanthropy start to both push their thumb into the sides of these folks that are in the helping industry. Often philanthropy is like, well, it's not our software, it's theirs. But yes, you bought that software. You are using the buzzwords at your conferences with chicken dinners, using these words. And so what we need to do is start to repurpose this help industry in a way that allows them to think about those on the ground. Because what those helping industry folks are trying to serve oftentimes is philanthropy and not community folks. And I think we need community folks to be in the best interest and in our sights of philanthropy so that those helping industry folks can start to redesign and reconceptualize themselves. If that doesn't happen, then this industry is going to continue to grow and to be predatory on the backs of those that we say we care about and the missions that we say we care about.
Sobering, but fair. Sobering, but fair. Carina, I'm going to turn to you. At the beginning of your essay, you pose the question, what does it mean to be successful in philanthropy, and whose success are we focused on? You unpack the role that evidence has played in your work across 3 projects over the past decade, and it leads you to articulate 5, and maybe a 6th one is emerging. Maybe it has emerged since you wrote the essay. Design principles to improve a strategy's equity orientation, what you call just philanthropy. We don't have time to get into all 5, but could you share one of them and an illustration of how that principle was useful to you?
Yeah. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about evidence-based strategies and how you can think differently about them. So I already gave the example of asking very different questions, like what are the unintended consequences instead of just the impact, and really reframing. Another one is about sort of insights. I think I mentioned that ERDIT fellowship that I was a part of, and my biggest worry about actually participating in that fellowship was I had 3 months to come up with a big idea, and that wasn't going to give me the time to talk to those with lived experience and most proximate to the problem. And I think it's those insights that matter most when you're trying to design a new strategy, and taking the time to really gather those insights from people who are most close to the problem. And I think that's the step that philanthropy often skips, and shouldn't. Logic models get created, business consultants come in, and it's very close to where how John talks about community. He's gathering insights from the community. And we don't always do that. And I think that's a really important step that leads to good strategies, bad strategies, strategies that have more impact, and strategies that have less impact. And then I think another thing that's really important to do is to think about new ways of thinking about outcomes. So at most education philanthropies, the gold star for outcomes is student achievement. And I think we've evolved from just lagging indicators to leading indicators, and thinking about everything from belonging to other issues as indicators that foreshadow whether or not you're going to have impact. In my world, it was around networks. I had launched a teacher network, and you could have said, well, what's the impact of that teacher network on student achievement, which I was not going to be able to prove. It was a 1.8 million online teacher network. I'm not going to be able to find the evidence for that. But if you reshift it and think, wow, nobody knows teaching like teachers. Teachers want to be seen as leaders in learning. And we've just built a powerful network where teachers can talk to teachers. The network was the outcome. But that wasn't recognized at the outcome at the time. And so I do think that there's this shift. One of the design principles that I mentioned in my chapter is about network thinking as opposed to just systems thinking. And network thinking leads you to think about different outcomes that may not be traditional, but that may lead to different types of impact.
Thank you. John, you started to talk about this in the answer to your last question, but I want to get into it a little bit more. You write about how thriving organizations learn from their development and successes, but in your essay, you note that far too many nonprofits focus their limited evaluation capacity on reporting for funders rather than building their capacity to use data and evidence better. So you've identified that as the problem. What can funders do to fix this? I mean, it's clearly a central problem in the sector, but can you just lay out a couple of your thinking about this?
Yeah. So there's 2 points that I want to make as a way to kind of step into this. The first one is, 70% of the nonprofit sector are small organizations, and that's similar to what 80% of businesses are small businesses, right? Like most organizations that are doing this work on the ground and are getting their fingernails dirty every day are doing this as small organizations. Those organizations don't have R&D departments. I mean, they just don't. And they don't for a variety of reasons, right? So that's a first point that's just really important. And so if you are asking for R&D type numbers from organizations that are not built or structured in such a way to be able to provide that, that's a challenge. I think the second one is that we in the nonprofit sector have a huge emphasis on program outcomes and less emphasis on organizational health. And to me, that's bananas, right? I mean, when you ask a nonprofit, if you ask a funder or you ask a nonprofit, tell me about what a strong organization means. And let's just say you ask 25 people, you're going to get 25 different responses. And most of the time, most of those folks are not trained on what does it mean to be a strong organization. And that is a real weakness in our sector. Right. So, and it's a weakness for a variety of reasons, but as a philanthropist, it's a weakness. Number one, the first point about R&D, we got to get away from program funding and be providing organizations the resources they need to use the money any way they want, because they're the experts in their work. They know what they need. And if they want to evaluate and do the work really well, they need the money and the capital to be able to do that, which also means provide fund. If you're asking for R&D type numbers, you need to provide R&D type financial to do that. But then also, if you're focused on program and you're not focused on organization, that's a real challenge. And for our standpoint, we focus on organizational health. We think that a community of strong organizations who know their North Star is going to be far better than a countryside of weak nonprofits who have really strong programs, which doesn't exist. And so for us, like, we provide organizational assessments. We produced a report a couple of years ago, which was the largest place-based report on the organizational health of a city, called the State of the Sector Report. And what we found in that report is that we had a lot of really challenged and weak nonprofits for a variety of reasons who were reporting they were really good at counting. And that's just a real challenge. And so I think we need to have a shift that moves funders and others away from this overemphasis on focusing on programs. Listen, I want to see communities do the things that they want to do. No one is helped by us walking into communities and saying, tell me how much, how many kickballs there are, or how many kids are showing up here or there. They want that too, but they don't need us to do that. What they need us to do is provide the resources they need to make their organizations strong. And then as a philanthropy, we need to get a lot smarter about organizational health. And we need to tilt our approaches to being more focused on organizational health. And I think us doing that over the long term will ensure stronger communities doing the work that they need to do. And they're going to be showing really strong outcomes on the ground level.
But you're not insensitive to the desire for philanthropy to have some outcome metrics from their grantees, I know.
No, of course not. Listen, I want those metrics. They just have to be owned by community. Right.
Okay.
And so done in partnership with community. Right. And so, again, as I said before, community wants community change more than you do. Right? That is their community. It is their neighbors. They want that. You can lock arms with them and say to them, what is your North Star? And how do we help you both measure if that's what you want to do, but move to that place? And how can we create infrastructure? Now, from the philanthropy side, part of that is fund them differently, whether it's general operating or whether it's providing funding in that way, or build capacity, right? I just showed you, we do organizational assessments and a variety of other things that help build the capacity of local organizations. And it's towards the idea that we want neighborhoods that have strong leaders, strong organizations, and strong networks. We believe that if those three things happen in any neighborhood, that the outcomes will happen. But what we shouldn't do is go in and demand strong programs at the expense of strong leaders, strong organizations, and strong networks. And so for us, it's co-creating, and in fact, not even co-creating, being led by that, and then using the infrastructure of philanthropy and companies and otherwise to help them get to those spaces on their own.
Can I add something to that, Tamar, because there's a question in the Q&A that's related to what John was just talking about how do you change this dynamic of like the bean counting way in which philanthropy works. And I think another thing besides the things that John has said is that philanthropy can ask different questions. One time I asked a grantee, what's your best relationship with a funder and what was it like? And they sadly, it wasn't with the Gates Foundation, it was with another foundation. And he said, and I said, well, why was it so incredible? And he said, it's because they treated me as an equal and they didn't act as if they knew more than me and we were learning together. And so I think the different kinds of questions that, nonprofits want to show philanthropy all that they have produced and done to hold themselves accountable. But if philanthropy asks different questions like, what did you learn? Where was your failure? What are you going to do differently next time? And gave the money out differently to accommodate for shifts. A lot of times, particularly at larger foundations, the money comes out too large, too much, too at once. And you can't make the shifts that you need to make on the ground because we're counting beans somewhere else. Right. So it's being more nimble about the way in which the money goes out, what you're counting, but it's also the questions you're asking. It's more about what you're learning and where your failure is and how you're going to pivot. And that never comes out in philanthropy in that way. It almost never, shouldn't say it never does. I'm sure John does it better than most.
Well, I'd love to add on to that because it's such a good point. I mean, I think there's 2 points that I would make. The first one would be that philanthropy are not great learners either, right? We we're treated in a way like all my jokes are funny and I'm way smarter than I really am. And that's only the reason for that is because I'm in philanthropy. But I know because of the people I have around me who let me know you're not that funny and you're kind of smart, but not really, right? That helped me keep grounded, including community partners who feel a trust enough to be able to say that. So I think that's the first one that I think is really important. And what I would say to that is, I remember visiting with when I was a consultant with 7 New York City philanthropies, and they were trying to figure out how do they move the needle around poverty alleviation. And what I said to them is, great, well, you all are getting this many reports every day cumulatively, or every year cumulatively. What do those reports say? And they looked at me like I was showing a dog a card trick. I mean, they just had no idea what cumulatively that data did. And so what I say is, philanthropy is not great at learning. And if philanthropy wants to also do this work really well, it has to start to look itself in the mirror and say, what am I doing with all this information? I think the second real quick point that I would say is the most popular question in grant applications is the need statement, right? Tell me your need. And groups spend a lot of time saying, well, hey, this year is really challenging and we're more challenged than last year. And by showing more challenge gives you the opportunity to potentially get more money. That is so backwards, right? To be able to be what we want, to Carina's point, what we want to do is ask better questions. A need statement is not helpful. Number one, you should not be looking at any communities as problems or needs to be solved. Communities are filled with amazing assets and gifts and resources. And what you should be doing, the question changed, is how are you utilizing the amazing gifts that you have in community to take your community to the next level? How do you partner with all those amazing people in your community, right? Because that is the webbing that you just can't count. That's better than saying, Tamar, tell me what's wrong with you. And are you worse than you were last year? Oh, great. Well, you're worse. Let me partner with you. That there is no social change that is achieved in that dynamic. It is only achieved by the idea of utilizing assets and moving those assets to better places. If you look at the history of social movements, it is always asset built, not deficiency built.
I have a question along to the side a little bit. How do you get this conversation going if you're, let's say it's a new conversation with, maybe it's a practitioner who's getting money from a foundation, maybe it's one of your peers in philanthropy, and this is not what they think. Like, how do you engage in this and get them? What are your suggestions? Because you guys are both leaders. How do you get this moving?
Well, the one thing I would say, and then I think Carina probably has an amazing answer. Philanthropy doesn't like it when other philanthropy tells them what to do. Right. So like if I went to Carina, I'd be like, yeah, you guys should do it this way. Carina's gonna be like, what? Like that just doesn't work. So for me, at least, what I believe is, and why I'm so proud of being part of the leadership of the trust-based philanthropy movement, is we have created what is one of the very most pure movements in philanthropy that we've ever seen. But it is built on the idea of folks within that movement practicing their work and then others being influenced by it. So the best way that I can help my peers is by practicing every day what I believe is the purest form of philanthropy that should be practiced, and then talking with others. So since the murder of George Floyd, nearly 300 global brands have approached us to say, we want to have authentic relationships in community. Right? We had 20 Minneapolis companies saying, hey, like our city's on fire. We heard about what you did in Baltimore and we want that. And I was like, cool. Part of that is recognizing that the reason that people are standing on 38th in Chicago and Minneapolis is that they're upset at the conditions that you helped create. And in order for you to recreate relationship, you have to acknowledge the damage that you did, and you have to change the way that you do that. And they said, okay, well, show us your playbook. And we were like, it's available to you. Now, if I had gone out and advocated and done that in a different way, they wouldn't have heard it. And so I think the best way is, both within trust-based or other things that you're involved in, is continually try to practice each and every day a better form of the work that you're doing, understanding that there's, in this space, there's always work to be done, and there's a legacy of damage that has been done that we have to alleviate each and every day.
Mm.
Yeah. I don't think I have a better answer than John. I guess I would just say that I would encourage grantees to push back. It's often intimidating to push back to a
It
funder.
is.
But I think it's important. And the second thing I'd say is that I think we have to get more people in philanthropy that understand this perspective. And I know a lot of people that stay in philanthropy, people of color who stay in philanthropy and are quite conflicted about it. And I think you need to stay to make changes, and then you leave and you make those changes in whatever you do next. So I think it's a cultural problem in philanthropy that can only be fixed by people and changing culture.
Well, I know the field is grateful to people like you. It's not only you, there are many people, but that are making the changes, right, every day. So thank you for that. Okay, we just have a few more minutes before we're actually answering some of the questions from the field already, so that's good. But let's do a round of quick responses, and then we'll turn to Q&A, open Q&A. Short answers. Looking ahead, to better foster learning, equity, and community empowerment, what should philanthropy do more of in the world of data and evaluation? Either of you.
I'll give you a quick one.
Sure.
I think philanthropy needs to do more intersectional thinking. We
Okay.
need to think at the intersection, not in education, not in health, not in technology, but thinking at the intersection of multiple priorities
Perfect.
and problems.
Perfect. John, I'm gonna make it quick now.
Yeah, I'm going to go quick. And, if you put a nickel in me, I'll go on forever. So I'm going to really work hard to be quick. But what I would say is be committed to learning. And, learning is a drinking word game. And if, we were drinking right now, we'd be drunk in 10 minutes by using that word. But what I mean by that is be really committed to the idea that if you're going to learn, that means you're going to know that there's a gap in what you know and acknowledge that. And two, you're going to be a good listener to the people that you may not have listened to before. And listening, while may seem easy, it is really hard. And so really being committed to the idea that you're going to listen to community, listen to the experts, and you're going to use that knowledge to not only learn, but to change your practice.
Same question. Looking ahead, to better foster learning, equity, and community empowerment, what should philanthropy do less of in the world of data and evaluation?
I'm going to say, a friend of mine talks about it this way. He says, instead of looking to solve problems, we need to create new opportunities. How does philanthropy stop trying to solve problems, but create new opportunities? More of that.
Yeah. Philanthropy is best when it understands that it is not out in front, and that its job is to be quiet and to be led, not to lead, but to be led. And so philanthropy is committed to the idea of being led by the people on the ground that are doing the work. Great things will happen. If they can't get out of their own way and they like to shine and they want to be out in front, then the good things won't happen as much.
Last one sort of pet thing, one actionable next step that you are passionate about that is too often overlooked.
Me and Carina are doing the who's going to go first. Well,
I know. I don't care.
No, I'll just say I think often, Carina and I probably go to many of the same conferences, and philanthropy loves to convene, right?
Right.
The thing is that in these convenings we don't do a lot of learning, and that means sitting at tables and being critical of each other. And I think we need to be in spaces where we say hard things and we challenge. I was a community organizer. Part of community organizing is agitating each other because you love the mission of what you're trying to achieve. We are way too safe and comfortable And if you're in the work of social change and you feel really comfortable, then the work's not being done well. And I think we in our spaces need to be challenging to each other. If I'm in a space, Carina, I commit to challenging you and then giving you a hug after, if you allow that, right? Because we care about the world being better. It only gets better if we challenge each other in real ways.
Yeah. I want to say something about technology because we haven't talked about AI and technology. And
Great.
I just, the thing that I've done is really spent a lot. I'm not a technology first person. I'm like John, I'm a relationship person first. But I spent a lot of time working on technology projects and getting underneath it to really understand what's possible. And like the action that I have been taking around technology has not been designing technology for today, but designing technology for what's possible tomorrow. So not trying to use technology to solve the current systems problems, but to create those opportunities in the future, and thinking very differently about the role and use of technology, both in evidence collection or assessment, for example. I think we're not using our imagination enough because we feel constrained by the current system. So the thing I like to do is think further out and not be constrained by the system.
Fantastic. Oh, I love this. Okay, let's turn now to the audience. And I'm seeing that there's only one question that we haven't touched on at all yet. It's from Connor. Can you both see it, Carina and John? I'm reading it at the same time as you are. Let's just take a look.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I understand what Connor is saying. So, this is what I would say is, we developed an evaluative approach that, and it was untrusted in the beginning because we weren't trusted. And we essentially said, we developed a framework and said, tell us what your North Star is, the 3 ways you think you're going to get there. And then underneath that, like, what are the ways in which you're going to measure how you get there? And then we want you to report to what the red, green, and yellows are on that. When we've got the first reports, everybody was reporting greens. And we're trying to alleviate some of the toughest challenges in Baltimore. We know that those aren't greens, but they didn't feel comfortable saying what the yellows and reds were. And as we developed this, we finally got to a place where this framework, they were telling us all the reds and they felt comfortable in doing that. And so, Connor, you asked the question about if you're not sure about your North Star. The one thing we knew by that exercise was you're allowed to shape and shift yourself to different places because the world is changing. We just had an inauguration. The world looks differently today than it did 2 months ago. Is that right? And so your North Star may shift and change based on that. That is okay. What I know is you're the expert in understanding that. And if you are changing that, now you had some questions about financials. I think being open and transparent with community about where you are financially, program-wise, or otherwise is a smart thing to do. But I think it's also more important that as you're walking and doing this work, that the world is going to change and you're allowed to change within it.
Carina, would you add anything to that?
No, I wouldn't.
Okay. I'm just gonna, there's a question from Kimberlyn. Hi, Kimberlyn Butler in the webinar chat. What's your forecast on philanthropy as a sector in 2030 if we stay on the current trajectory and none of the interventions or ideas we're discussing are not implemented? Who wants it?
Go ahead, Carina.
I think the role of philanthropy is going to be even more important in the next 4 or 5 years. And I think philanthropy has been shifting in good ways. And I want philanthropy to continue that path and standing up for things that we aren't seeing. I think the thing that's I'm nervous about philanthropy is that sometimes we can uphold the existing system and not even realize we're doing it through our investments because we're trying to be politically correct, play both sides, not upset too many coalitions, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many reasons why it's rational. But I think that philanthropy has to be future forward, inspired now and future forward, as one of my colleagues says. And so thinking a little bit further out is what I wish philanthropy did a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing I would add to that is, I mean, if you look at the way in which the money flows to the problems that we're trying to solve, philanthropy, and most times at the local level, is about 15 to 20% of the safety net, with government being 60 to 70, right? So if you think about our safety net and where philanthropy's role within that safety net is, I think the idea of public-private partnership and those types of areas, philanthropy is going to have to get a stronger set of sea legs to be able to push its thumb into the side of government. Because what we see now is government is more and more asking philanthropy to pay for things that they can't pay for, they paid for 5 years ago. And I think philanthropy is going to have to get organized to be able to say, no, like our role is here. And if our 18%, which I surmise is now really 10%, that we've lost 8% in this world of public-private partnership, right? Like ARPA dollars and all of these things have widely not been used very effectively. And now philanthropy is on the hook to fill those spots. Or philanthropy has got to be really good at organizing itself. And then in that organization, pushing our thumb into the side of government at all levels to say, we need you to be better. And if we do that, that 18% is going to fully realize itself. If we don't do that, that 18% is going to be 40 cents on the dollar. And that would be unfortunate.
One more question, last question that just came in the chat box. I'm representing Omni Institute Center of Social Investment. I wanted to ask what lesson needs to be unlearned in this space.
That's a really good question. I would say philanthropy the best part of being in trust-based philanthropy in this movement is unlearning the behaviors that we thought we needed to have, right? So, my board, when we were adopting trust-based philanthropy principles, were like, well, why would we do this? Why would we invest this way? And, when we showed that the ways that we were doing work not only wasn't helpful to our knowledge, but actually did damage on the ground. And so I think our commitment to unlearning the how of our practice, the way it looks today, would be the biggest commitment that I think we need to have.
Okay, I think I might say something unpopular, but here goes anyway. I think philanthropy has to unlearn the business consultant model.
Yeah.
The logic model is killing us, and it doesn't actually work in
Yes.
social impact in the same way that it does in other fields, I'll say.
Yes.
And I think we need to unlearn that reliance on thinking we can solve things with a business consultant mindset.
Well, by the way, I mean, I'm sitting in a Fortune 500 company. Nonprofits are different than businesses, and they should be. There's a special sauce that comes into being a nonprofit or a social change group. What's happening in the social sector is that we're adopting business practices and then calling it effective, when in fact they should be separate. So to Carina's really good point, nonprofits intrinsically do their work in a way that's really awesome, and they should respect that. And when you have business practices come in, whether it's business management consulting or otherwise, saying, hey, practice this because we're a business, that needs to be pushed back on if it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think we need theories of impact and theories of change, and we need to check ourselves on that. We just can't use a logic model.
No.
There's resonance in the group. Oh, there's one final question. Okay, my goodness. Abigail is asking, in this current presidential administration, what should philanthropy unlearn?
Well, I mean, Abby, it's a really good question. I think the thing that I would say is, in this administration that's coming up, I just had a group call me yesterday, a national education group, and they basically were like, oh my God, all these executive orders, like, what should we do? And my comment to them is, you're now asking that, right? Like, the best boats that can navigate volatility are the boats that build infrastructure, no matter who's in power, who's in administration. And so the best thing that I would say is organizations need to get really good at understanding policy frameworks, understanding development and bringing donors and others into the circle. This administration is going to, like any administration, is going to change the safety net. And understanding how they're going to change the safety net and how local movement, grassroots organizations, and otherwise can build infrastructure to sustain that volatility will be the organizations that are best prepared to navigate those currents.
Yeah. I would say that philanthropy needs to really double down on bridging capital and articulating their values. I think philanthropy does not always articulate their values and lead with their values, but prioritize bridging capital.
And with that, I'm so sorry to have to end the conversation now, but just it's time. And I want to extend my deepest gratitude to both of you, John and Carina. What a fantastic conversation. I want to thank everybody who joined on the line. We really appreciate your engagement, your questions, your concerns. Stay engaged. We hope you join us. This is part of an ongoing series of Next Generation Now conversations where authors discuss themes from their essays. Our next pair of authors will be announced soon. We hope you'll join us. And if there's anything we can do to facilitate connections among all of you, just let us know. This is our purpose, and we're just glad to be here. So until next time, thank you.
Thank you, Tamar.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Take care.